First contact and deception. The Kraxan Empire had conquered 1,000 worlds without firing a single shot. Their victory was measured not in the ruins of cities or the ashes of civilizations, but in the subtle reshaping of societies that never knew they were being invaded at all. Supreme Coordinator Valthek stood before the Great Assembly, his translucent body pulsing with patterns of light that conveyed both satisfaction and anticipation. The holographic displays surrounding him showed images of a blue-green planet, rotating slowly in the darkness of space. Earth, he announced, his bioluminescent patterns shifting to emphasize key points of his presentation. A Class 3 civilization on the brink of interstellar capability. Primitive by our standards, but fascinating in their own way. They possess a trait we've never encountered before: they deliberately seek out and create chaos. The assembly chambers filled with ripples of concern, members' bodies flickering with patterns of confusion and disgust. The Kraxans had built their empire on perfect order, on the careful manipulation of predictable patterns. Their telepathic abilities allowed them to subtly influence other species, guiding them toward what the Kraxans saw as ideal society, one of perfect harmony and predictability. Observe, Valthek continued, projecting images of human cities. They build their dwellings in irregular patterns. Their music contains deliberate discordance. Their art celebrates asymmetry. Even their scientific method embraces uncertainty. And yet, somehow, they progress. The Assembly's leading anthropologist, Zinare, moved forward, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns of scholarly interest. Most concerning is their information network. It's chaotic, filled with contradictions and misinformation, yet they navigate it with surprising effectiveness. They seem to have developed an immunity to confusion that we've never seen before. Valthek's patterns shifted to display confidence. Which is precisely why we must adjust our standard approach. Earth will be our greatest challenge, and our greatest achievement. We will need to be subtle beyond anything we've attempted before. The invasion began with whispers. The Kraxans had perfected the art of societal manipulation over millennia, using their telepathic abilities to plant seeds of thought in susceptible minds. Usually, they would identify the most logical, ordered thinkers in a society and work through them. But on Earth, they found these individuals were often the most isolated from real power. Instead, they discovered something unexpected: humans were most influenced by emotional resonance, not logical consistency. The Kraxans had to learn to manipulate feelings, a concept so foreign to their ordered minds that many of their best agents experienced psychological crises trying to comprehend it. They started small. A feeling of unease about a new technology here. A surge of irrational confidence in a failing system there. The kind of subtle manipulations that had brought 1,000 worlds under their control. But Earth proved different. The humans' chaos-adapted minds seemed to process these manipulations in unexpected ways. Where the Kraxans planted seeds of doubt, humans often grew forests of innovation. Where they introduced subtle fears, humans developed new systems of resilience. Dr. Sarah Chen, head of the Quantum Computing Division at MIT, was the first to notice something was wrong, though she didn't know what she was noticing. She specialized in pattern recognition algorithms, and something about the global trends in technology adoption wasn't adding up. "Look at this," she told her colleague, Dr. James Martinez, pointing to a complex data visualization. Every other major technological breakthrough in history has had random adoption patterns. But these new quantum systems? The adoption is too perfect. It's like watching crystals grow. Martinez leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Could be just better implementation strategies. We've learned a lot about technology rollouts over the years. No, Chen insisted, pulling up more data. It's not just tech. Look at social movements, fashion trends, even language evolution. Everything's becoming more ordered. More predictable. That's not how human society works. We're messy. We're chaotic. This level of organization isn't natural. What Chen couldn't know was that she was experiencing exactly what made humans different, the ability to recognize patterns in chaos, and more importantly, to recognize when chaos was unnaturally absent. The very trait that the Kraxans saw as primitive was about to become their greatest challenge. In their orbital observation pod, Valthek and Zinare watched Chen with growing concern. Their bodies pulsed with patterns of worry that would have been obvious to any Kraxan, but were invisible to human eyes. She shouldn't be able to see this, Zinare's patterns conveyed. Their minds are supposed to be too primitive to recognize such subtle manipulations. Valthek's response patterns were complex, showing both concern and fascination. Perhaps we have misunderstood what primitive means. They don't seek order, they seek understanding. And they understand chaos in ways we never have. The first phase of their invasion was failing, but neither Valthek nor Zinare could understand why. They were about to learn that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their ability to create order from chaos, but in their ability to recognize when order wasn't natural at all. And somewhere in the vast data centers of Earth, pattern recognition algorithms were beginning to pick up anomalies that would soon cascade into the greatest challenge the Kraxan Empire had ever faced, a species that didn't just resist their perfect order, but thrived in its absence. The silent invasion. Dr. Sarah Chen's discovery spread through academic circles like a virus, not in the ordered, predictable way the Kraxans had come to expect from their other conquests, but in sporadic bursts that defied logical progression. Some dismissed her findings as conspiracy theories, while others built upon them in ways she hadn't anticipated. Across the globe, others were beginning to notice similar patterns. In Lagos, a social media analyst named Oluwaseun Adebayo discovered that trending topics had become suspiciously predictable. In Mumbai, a statistical anthropologist noted that cultural evolution had started following mathematical progressions rather than its usual chaotic path. In Buenos Aires, a teenage gamer realized that even random number generators weren't behaving quite randomly anymore. Valthek watched these developments with increasing concern, his crystalline form pulsing with patterns that would have translated to frustration in human terms. "They're seeing order where they should see progress," he communicated to the assembly. "Their resistance to harmony defies all our previous models." The Kraxans had never encountered a species that treated chaos as a resource rather than a threat. Their attempts to impose order were creating exactly the kind of patterns that humans had evolved to detect. Millions of years of predator avoidance and pattern recognition had crafted the human mind into something the Kraxans hadn't predicted, a chaos-sensing engine. Dr. Martinez, initially skeptical of Chen's theories, found himself drawn into the investigation. "Look at this," he said one evening, pulling up global weather patterns. "Even climate systems are showing signs of unusual organization. It's subtle, but it's there." Chen nodded, her eyes fixed on the data. "It's like something's trying to smooth out all the rough edges of human civilization. But that's not how complex systems work. Complexity needs those rough edges, they're where adaptation happens." What neither of them realized was that their conversation was being monitored by Kraxan observers, who were becoming increasingly alarmed at humans' ability to detect their influence. The Empire had never failed to subdue a species before, and they weren't about to start now. The Kraxans accelerated their efforts, pushing harder to impose order on human society. They increased their telepathic influence, trying to guide human thought patterns toward more predictable outcomes. But this only made the patterns more obvious to those who knew how to look. In her apartment that night, Chen received an encrypted message from Adebayo: "The patterns aren't just in social media anymore. They're in everything. Stock markets, traffic patterns, even random draws in sports events. It's like the universe is losing its entropy." The human resistance to order wasn't organized, it couldn't be, because organization was exactly what they were fighting against. Instead, it emerged organically, a chaotic network of individuals all recognizing the same impossible patterns independently. A group of quantum physicists in Geneva noticed that quantum uncertainty measurements were becoming slightly less uncertain. Street artists in Tokyo realized their random spray patterns were becoming more predictable. Chess grandmasters reported that game outcomes were following statistical patterns that shouldn't have been possible. The Kraxans had never encountered a species that could weaponize disorder. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that progress required perfect harmony, that chaos was the enemy of advancement. But humans were proving that chaos wasn't just a stage of development to be overcome, it was a fundamental tool of survival. Valthek called an emergency session of the assembly. "We must adapt our approach," his patterns pulsed urgently. "These humans, they don't just resist order, they actively seek out its absence. Our traditional methods are making us visible to them." Zinare's response patterns showed deep concern. "Perhaps we should consider direct intervention. If we cannot guide them subtly, perhaps we must show ourselves and explain the benefits of order." But Valthek knew that would be their last resort. The Empire's power had always rested on its ability to influence without being seen. Direct intervention would be an admission of failure, something that hadn't happened in 10,000 years of conquest. Meanwhile, Chen and her growing network of pattern seekers were piecing together a larger picture. The order they were seeing wasn't just affecting physical systems, it was changing how humans thought, how they made decisions, how they evolved. "Whatever this is," Chen wrote in a secure message to her colleagues, "it's trying to make us predictable. And predictability is the one thing humanity has always fought against." As the Kraxans watched their carefully orchestrated plans unravel, they began to realize a fundamental truth about the species they were trying to conquer: humans hadn't survived because they were the strongest, or the most intelligent, or the most organized. They had survived because they were the most adaptable, the most comfortable with uncertainty, the most resistant to the very order that the Kraxans saw as salvation. And in their orbital stations, hidden from human sight, the Kraxan observers began to experience something they had never known before: doubt. Their perfect order was being undone not by force or technology, but by humanity's embrace of the very chaos they had spent millennia trying to eliminate. Pattern recognition. The moment that changed everything wasn't a dramatic revelation or a global catastrophe, it was a simple question from a 10-year-old girl in Seattle. During a virtual classroom session about probability, she asked, "Why don't random things feel random anymore?" Her teacher had dismissed the question, but Dr. Chen, who happened to be giving a guest lecture on computational mathematics that day, felt her blood run cold. Children, with their minds still unbound by rigid patterns of thought, were noticing the subtle wrongness that adults had learned to ignore. The Kraxans hadn't accounted for human children in their models. Their own species developed with fully formed logical frameworks, making childhood imagination an alien concept to them. They couldn't comprehend that human children's seemingly chaotic thought patterns were actually sophisticated pattern recognition systems operating without filters. "Their offspring are detecting our influence," Valthek reported to the assembly, his crystalline form clouded with uncertainty. "They perceive patterns that their adults dismiss as impossible. We cannot predict what they will notice next." The Empire's carefully constructed web of influence was being unraveled by nursery rhymes and playground games. Children across the globe began making up songs about the too perfect patterns, and drawing pictures of symmetrical shadows where there should be none. Dr. Chen started collecting these children's observations, creating a database that revealed something extraordinary. The kids weren't just noticing the patterns, they were instinctively fighting against them. They deliberately made their games more random, added unnecessary chaos to their activities, and celebrated unpredictability in ways that disrupted the Kraxans' careful manipulations. In their orbital observation posts, the Kraxan analysts watched in growing horror as their influence began to slip. Humanity wasn't just resisting their ordered patterns, they were actively generating chaos to counter them. Zinare's research team made a devastating discovery: human creativity actually increased under pressure to conform. The more the Kraxans pushed for order, the more humans innovated ways to be unpredictable. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, showing Chen a global analysis of creative outputs. "Art, music, literature, they're all becoming more experimental, more chaotic. It's like humanity's subconscious is screaming that something's wrong by cranking up the disorder. The Kraxans had never encountered a species that became more chaotic under pressure. Their standard invasion protocol relied on societies becoming more rigid and predictable when stressed, making them easier to control. But humans were doing the opposite, they were embracing chaos as a defense mechanism. Street art became more abstract, music incorporated more discord, and even architecture began favoring asymmetrical designs. Humans were unconsciously fighting back against the imposed order in ways the Kraxans couldn't counter without revealing themselves. Valthek made a desperate attempt to accelerate their influence. The Kraxans increased their telepathic broadcasts, trying to force human minds into more ordered patterns. But this only triggered humanity's deeply ingrained resistance to mental manipulation. Dr. Chen's network of pattern seekers began documenting cases of what they called spontaneous chaos generation, people deliberately introducing random elements into their daily lives as if inoculating themselves against some unseen force of order. A breakthrough came when a group of neuroscientists discovered that human brains showed increased activity in pattern recognition centers when exposed to perfect order. The very structures the Kraxans were trying to impose were triggering humanity's threat detection systems. Our brains evolved to spot predators by noticing unnatural patterns in nature, Chen explained during a secret online conference. Too much order sets off the same alarm bells as a tiger's stripes in the jungle. We're biologically primed to resist it. The Kraxan assembly was facing an unprecedented crisis. Their perfect invasion strategy was being defeated not by superior technology or military might, but by humanity's inherent resistance to perfection itself. They're not just adapting to our influence, Zinare reported, her patterns showing clear distress. They're developing new ways of thinking specifically designed to counteract it. Every attempt we make to impose order just creates new forms of chaos. The children who first noticed the patterns were now leading the unconscious resistance. Their games became more complex, their stories more unpredictable, their very thinking patterns a weapon against the Kraxans' influence. As the Empire's control began to slip, humanity's natural state of organized chaos began to reassert itself. But the Kraxans weren't ready to admit defeat. They had one final strategy, one that would either break humanity's resistance or change the Empire forever. The human variable. The Kraxan Empire's final strategy was both brilliant and desperate, they would attempt to understand chaos itself. For a civilization built on perfect order, it was like trying to breathe underwater. But they had never failed to conquer a world, and they weren't about to start now. Valthek assembled a special research unit, tasked with the impossible. They would immerse themselves in human chaos theory. The unit's members were chosen for their ability to process contradictory information, a rare trait among their kind. Their mission was to decode humanity's apparent randomness and find patterns they could exploit. But as they studied humans more closely, they discovered something that shook the foundations of their civilization. What looked like chaos to them was actually a complex adaptive system that operated on principles they had never considered possible. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, had made a breakthrough of her own. "Look at this," she told Martinez, displaying a global map of anomalies. "The patterns of order aren't just becoming more visible, they're becoming predictable. Whatever's causing this, it's starting to leave fingerprints." The Kraxans had always prided themselves on being undetectable, but their increasing desperation was making them sloppy. Their attempts to understand chaos were ironically making their own patterns more obvious. A teenager in Tokyo noticed that her favorite random playlist algorithm wasn't random anymore. A street performer in Paris realized his improvised performances were becoming unconsciously structured. A day trader in New York discovered that market volatility was following mathematical progressions that shouldn't have been possible. These seemingly unrelated observations all pointed to the same conclusion: something was trying to impose order on humanity, and in doing so, was revealing itself. "They're learning," Zinare reported to the assembly, her patterns showing a mix of admiration and fear. "Every attempt we make to understand their chaos gives them more data about our order. They're using our own analysis against us." The human mind, it turned out, was uniquely suited to detecting artificial order. Millions of years of evolution had optimized it to spot patterns that didn't belong. A skill that had once helped spot camouflaged predators was now helping humanity identify an alien invasion they couldn't even see. Dr. Chen's network had grown into a global phenomenon. People everywhere were deliberately introducing randomness into their lives, not knowing why but feeling it was necessary. Flash mobs appeared without organization, art movements sprung up without manifestos, and music evolved in ways that defied categorization. The Craxon Research Unit made a devastating discovery: human chaos wasn't just random noise, it was a sophisticated information processing system. The very disorder they were trying to eliminate was actually humanity's greatest strength. Their chaos is adaptive, Valthek reported, his patterns showing deep disturbance. It's not just disorder, it's a defense mechanism against the kind of manipulation we've used to conquer 1,000 worlds. The Empire's perfect invasion strategy was being undone by its own perfection. The more they tried to impose order, the more humanity's chaos adapted to resist it. It was like trying to grab smoke: the harder they grasped, the more it slipped through their fingers. A quantum physicist in Geneva published a paper showing that true randomness was becoming increasingly rare in laboratory experiments. A chaos theorist in Buenos Aires demonstrated that weather patterns were showing impossible levels of organization. A cognitive scientist in Melbourne proved that human decision-making was becoming unnaturally predictable. Each discovery was another crack in the Craxon's invisible invasion. Their attempt to understand chaos had led them into a trap of their own making. They had become predictable to a species that specialized in spotting patterns. The Empire faced an impossible choice: continue their invasion and risk exposure, or retreat and admit that their perfect record of conquest had been broken by a species they had considered primitive. As Valthek stood before the assembly one final time, his patterns showed a complexity that no Craxon had ever displayed before. They had come to impose order on chaos, but instead, chaos had begun to impose itself on them. The human variable, it seemed, wasn't just a flaw in their invasion plan, it was a fundamental force they had never understood. And as the Empire's perfect order began to unravel, they faced a question that would change their civilization forever: what if chaos wasn't the enemy of progress, but its driving force? Evolution through chaos. The end of the Craxon Empire's perfect record began not with a surrender, but with a question. During an emergency session of the assembly, a junior researcher named Lex Ti displayed patterns that would have been considered heretical just months before. What if we're not failing to impose order on humanity? What if humanity is succeeding in teaching us chaos? The assembly chamber erupted in patterns of shock and outrage. But Valthek, watching the swirling colors of dissent among his people, realized something profound: their patterns of disagreement were no longer following the rigid structures of traditional Craxon debate. They had begun to show elements of unpredictability. Human chaos was infectious. On Earth, Dr. Chen had assembled a global conference of minds who had noticed the patterns. Physicists, artists, children, gamblers, weather forecasters, anyone who had observed the strange order infecting their world. But as they shared their observations, they noticed something else: the unnatural patterns were beginning to dissolve. It's like whatever was pushing us toward order is starting to embrace disorder itself, she explained, watching her data visualizations show increasing randomness. We're not just resisting it anymore, we're changing it. The Craxon Research Unit, led by Zinare, made a discovery that would reshape their civilization. They found that exposure to human chaos wasn't destroying their order, it was enhancing it. Their society had been stagnant for millennia, perfect but unchanging. Human unpredictability was teaching them how to evolve. Our perfection was our weakness, Valthek announced to the assembly, his patterns showing a complexity that would have been impossible before their encounter with Earth. We sought to eliminate chaos from the galaxy, never understanding that chaos is what drives evolution. Humanity hasn't resisted our order, they've shown us its limitations. The Empire's grand invasion ended not with a war or a surrender, but with a transformation. The Kraxans, for the first time in their history, chose to reveal themselves to a species they had attempted to conquer. But they came not as conquerors or defeated foes, they came as students. Dr. Chen's first meeting with Valthek was broadcast globally. Humans, finally seeing the beings who had tried to impose order on their world, were surprised to find creatures of crystalline beauty whose patterns now danced with a complexity that bridged the gap between order and chaos. "We came to teach you perfection," Valthek told her, his patterns flowing in ways that even his own people had never seen before. "Instead, you taught us evolution. Our order was stagnation disguised as progress. Your chaos is progress disguised as disorder." The integration of Kraxan and human society created something entirely new. The Kraxans learned to appreciate the beauty of imperfection, while humans gained a deeper understanding of the patterns underlying their chaos. Together, they began to explore a universe that was neither perfectly ordered nor completely random, but brilliantly, beautifully complex. Earth became known throughout the galaxy not as the world that defeated the Kraxan Empire, but as the world that transformed it. The humans' gift for finding patterns in chaos combined with the Kraxans' ability to create order from complexity led to advances that neither species could have achieved alone. The children who first noticed the strange patterns grew up in a world where crystalline aliens attended their art classes, learning to paint with deliberate imperfection, while human scientists worked with Kraxan researchers to develop technologies that operated on principles of controlled chaos. And in the Great Assembly Chamber, now open to human observers, Valthek's final presentation showed patterns that would have been incomprehensible to his people before their encounter with Earth. The perfect invasion failed because perfection itself was flawed. We sought to eliminate chaos from the universe, never understanding that chaos is what makes the universe worth preserving. The galaxy watched in wonder as the empire of perfect order and the species of embraced chaos came together, creating a new kind of civilization that understood a fundamental truth: true progress lies not in the elimination of disorder, but in the endless dance between chaos and order, each strengthening the other in an eternal cycle of evolution. And somewhere in Seattle, a now teenage girl who first noticed that random things weren't random anymore smiled as she watched cracks and patterns swirl in deliberately imperfect formations against the night sky, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting against change, but from teaching others how to embrace it.